For this segment, we'll be talking about Brad Stone's new book, The Upstarts. Brad Stone came into prominence in the tech community for his book, The Everything Store on Amazon. In this book, Brad Stone walks us through the early days of Airbnb and Uber all the way to present. I thought it was an engrossing read, very interesting. Adam, what are your thoughts?
So I also thought it was very informative. I thought it was well researched. I thought it gave me a lot of detail on these companies I didn't necessarily know coming in. This was in spite of it containing one of my least favorite tech book gimmicks, which is early on in the book, the author goes out to dinner with a prominent participant and tells you all about it. So in this case, it was Brad Stone going out to dinner with Travis of Uber. We find out about the menu, what they ate, everything they talked about. And I think the idea here is for Brad to kind of show his work, show you the level of access he got, mention how hard it was to get that access. But as a reader, you really kind of want to just jump into the content of the book itself. But overall, I thought the book was good. In particular, I like the fact that Brad took the time to go into the kind of competitors who are now, in many cases, sort of long forgotten, but kind of showed that neither Uber and Airbnb necessarily had that original of an idea. For Airbnb, for example, there were things like couchsurfing.com, which was kind of for college kids to connect with people around the world and just find a place to sleep overnight. For Uber, a lot of people had kind of figured out that the iPhone being introduced and apps and mapping and that kind of thing meant that taxis were ripe for disruption. You had competitors like Seamless Wheels that popped up that were kind of trying to do the same thing, but hadn't necessarily figured out kind of the ride sharing versus just kind of playing within existing taxi companies.
Sure, I thought the story of Airbnb was the most compelling in the book. Early on, you start with the background of the founders, which is actually a design background. So 2 of the 3 founders of Airbnb come from an industrial design background, with the other founder having a traditional computer science background. I thought this was very unique. They talk about the early days getting into Y Combinator, being known as the company that worked the hardest. They were there at the earliest, they were out, the last, and Paul Graham kind of says these guys are going to be successful no matter what. It actually takes quite a while for Airbnb to eventually become successful, and from that, I think their unique background becomes very helpful. They think a lot about the host experience. They think a lot about how people will interact with their platform. And early on, they lay down a set of principles and their values that I think have guided them to this day, that has really separated them from the competitor we see in the book, which is Uber.
Yeah, it took Uber many years before they laid down a set of company values. But like you said, Airbnb really do talk about these values constantly through the book. There's a lot of discussion about how when Airbnb opens a new headquarters, kind of the values are emblazoned around the building, which is odd because I think through a large portion of the book, you might say that Airbnb did not necessarily live those values too well. There are a number of scandals that Brad kind of details that do not paint Airbnb in a nice light. One of these was about a host named EJ who came back to her apartment to find that the guests had absolutely trashed it. Reaching out to Airbnb, she did not get much of a response at all. This led her to write a blog post which kind of went viral. It went to the top of Hacker News. And at that point, suddenly Airbnb was much more friendly, much more willing to help her out and actually give her some kind of compensation. And there's one very telling conversation where Nathan, one of the 3 founders, one of the computer science background at Airbnb, calls EJ to talk to her and basically says that this is an issue for the company because it's threatening their valuation, which makes you wonder if he'd read the company values at that point. Airbnb also have a number of issues in New York specifically around the regulatory climate. There's one issue with a host named Neil Warren who basically gets dragged into court and made an example of by New York, which is looking to crack down on these kind of illegal sublets. And again, Airbnb does not really help them out very much until it becomes clear that this court case could really affect their ability to operate in New York, at which point they suddenly become much more receptive to Neil's concerns. So all along reading this, I'm kind of thinking that, Airbnb talks a big game with their values, but, they're just kind of a profit-driven company like everyone else, and maybe shouldn't be looking to take the moral high ground here.
Absolutely. One thing you see here is the founders sort of grow up. The interesting thing is you start out with these design majors, in particular Brian Chesky, who's now the CEO, starts out, in this place where perhaps doesn't know too much about business or even tech, but really has this great idea that he thinks can work and sort of drives that to success. The interesting thing is, for somebody with this background, you would traditionally expect them to get replaced with a normal, traditional CEO. But he manages to keep this from happening. He retains control the entire time. He makes some really smart decisions. At the time, they have some outside competition in other markets. As they expand, there's a big question of should he acquire or should he continue expanding internally? And in that case, he makes the right decision. Actually learns a lot from Groupon's purchase of CityDeal and says, hey, I should actually retain control of this as we expand to other markets, and we can hold off these foreign competitors while we grow. He makes a lot of great decisions and now has kind of come to his own as a really, really good CEO. So part of that is this interesting story that that I was really enjoying following through the story.
Absolutely. I mean, if you compared Brian to Travis and kind of asked yourself early on in the book which one would still be standing, I think 95% of people would say that Travis would still be there as kind of an alpha dog of Uber, whereas Brian kind of looked like someone who was eminently replaceable. Although I would point out that the book kind of gives Travis, I think, a pretty flattering representation. In particular, you kind of see areas where Uber was actually somewhat conservative, contrary to kind of reputation they have of breaking every law imaginable today. So when ride-sharing first came out as kind of a concept, Uber was pretty skeptical because it was clearly illegal. Uber was only using licensed drivers for its app. They were actually trying to work somewhat with authorities. And it was actually competitors like Lyft and Sidecar who first kind of really implemented the idea of just letting anyone sign up to drive. And Travis points out in the book that this is clearly illegal. What are they doing? But it's kind of forced to go along with it once it's clear that they're going to get completely undercut on price and start losing a lot of market share. But it was interesting to me that Travis did actually take a somewhat restrained approach to a lot of these areas that Uber moved into. Although I do think it helps him, but the book kind of cuts off before things like the Susan Fowler blog post break. And you kind of see like the worst of Uber's culture.
Absolutely. One of the interesting juxtapositions in the book is the start of Uber in a place where it's seen as, on the moral high ground. They have public campaigns from Twitter to bring Uber to different cities or to stop regulators from trying to limit what Uber is doing in a city, all the way till today where Uber is seen in a much more negative light. And then on the other hand, you have Airbnb, which was initially going to be valued at a higher valuation than Uber. Obviously, that has changed now. But, they were seen as a company that was coming in, was disrupting housing markets to a degree that was very harmful. Now you've seen that change, where people are happy to have Airbnb come into their cities. It's almost seen as additive. Somehow we've kind of landed at a position where Airbnb is seen as additive to the hotel industry, whereas Uber is seen as replacing the taxi industry. And the other big difference I think we've noticed is that Airbnb is dealing with people with mortgages and leases, probably in a little bit better of a financial position, can avoid exploitation, unlike some of these Uber workers / contractors who are relying on this as their sole source of income and maybe don't have a lot of other options. So that part was very interesting to me, and this is something I think everybody should focus on if they read the book. All right, hopefully Adam will take me out to dinner soon. We will share our menu with you. This has been Random Talkers.